Sometimes repetition also helps. And so today, instead of covering new material, I'm going to sum up at least some of the intellectual arguments from the other day. Remember that the Kennedy book is very good on economics, on geopolitics and trade. But in some ways, for IR students, I think the ideas might be more interesting. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe some of you do like social history. I mean, this whole period that I talked about the other day, say roughly 1500 to 1650 or so. Again, there are many ways of describing it. I mean, if you were, let's say, on an oral exam to discuss this whole period in European history, it's a big period, obviously. You could talk about it as the period of the religious wars. We talked a lot about that, mostly, again, Protestant Catholic, with various sects. You can talk about it also in terms of a great inflation. Economic historians actually refer to this whole period as something like an age of crisis. The main reason, again, being this influx of silver and gold bullion, which wrought havoc with almost everyone's economy. It allowed, remember, the Spanish Hapsburg, the Spanish half of the Hapsburg line, to finance all of their wars, but was probably in the long run detrimental in that it kind of hollowed out the productive Spanish economy because the state simply depended on bullion. Bullion is the word we usually use to describe metallic money, that is silver or gold. So all of that is important too. In fact, economics we're going to get back to next week, particularly when we look at the long struggle between Britain and France for supremacy, or as I like to call it, the battle to determine whether the modern world will speak English or French. That's next week. For this week, though, remember the players are a bit different. You have the Habsburgs mostly as the protagonist on the establishment side, the side of the Catholics, the side of, for lack of a better word, imperium or hegemony, the effort to dominate Europe. And on the side of the upstart, that is the underdog, at least for a while, you have the Protestants. Remember, though, France was the wild card. France, and particularly Richelieu. So do we have a kind of a rough grasp of what raison d'etat is about? What it means, the term? Has anyone studied French before? Not yet. So how do we translate it again? Should pay attention. This is the kind of thing that might be on an exam. Of course, now that I've said that, I probably won't put it on the exam. But raison d'etat. There was an English sort of version of it, not exactly the same, but what's that word that we usually use in English? You've had IR theory before, right? So what do we call it in IR theory? Well, it's the opposite of idealism, right? Idealism does not equal, I think I heard it there, realism, right. Again, all of these things are oversimplifications, but idealism also sometimes is talked about in conjunction with the notion of ideology. We know what that word means, right? That word, it's kind of a modern locution. I personally find it sometimes misleading. Of course, examples of modern ideologies, famous ones, would include liberalism, socialism, Marxism. I suppose to some extent conservatism as a reaction to particularly liberalism and or Marxism. Isms in the English, or even basically in the Latin root, although I suppose in the Latin root they come out somewhat differently. What that means, it's like an idea system, right? It's a way of thinking about the world. A way of putting everything together. A Marxist sees the world mostly in terms of the means of production, which is to say the relationship between owners, producers, and workers. Classes, of course. Class warfare, the dialectic of class struggle. And a real Marxist, they really do see things in this way. You know, they can interpret anything, like a war, an event, an election, in those terms. They can tell you how it makes sense in those terms. Liberalism, we get confused today because in the West it means something very different from what it originally meant. But originally liberalism meant something like laissez-faire, that is, let do, a system of limited government and liberty for people to pursue their own interest, etc., etc. Well, usually then these ideologies are about, it seems like in the modern world they're all about economics, right? I mean, they're all about ways of organizing property in events. But again, that might be a creature of modern times. They weren't always like that. I mean, you could also think about ideology in pre-modern terms. You could think about Islam as an ideology. Or you could think about Catholicism, or particularly the Counter-Reformation, as an ideology. To a certain extent, you could even think of raison d'etat or realism as an ideology, except that in a way it's kind of like an anti-ideological ideology, by which I mean it is a system which rejects systems, right? The idea is, look, here you have the constraints. It's almost like a straitjacket. Ferdinand II thinks of himself as the Holy Roman Emperor. So he thinks that he has a duty. This is how he organizes his thoughts. In a way, he's denying himself agency. He's carrying out God's duty, right? Not that dissimilar from the way a caliph in carrying out a war. Whether it's an Ottoman caliph or earlier on one of the Baghdad or the Damascus or even the Egyptian caliphs, they are fighting on behalf of Islam. That is, they're not doing it because they're amusing themselves. They're doing it because that is their duty in life, because that is what you do. You are, the warrior. You are the great leader of Islam. It's kind of how he sees himself here. He is the warrior for Christianity. So his job is to make sure that Christians obey the right version of the faith, that they don't stray, that they aren't heretics. I mean, as he put it literally, I would rather die than grant any concessions to sectarians. Wage war for yourself, but for God. He even said at one point, again, if you read the Kissinger, this sounds pretty, frankly, frightening. He says, "Woe unto the king who ignores the voice of God, beseeching him to kill the heretics." That is, it is your duty not just to wage war on behalf of the faith, but to kill heretics. That is, those who stray from the faith. Of course, there are very strict schools in Islamic thought that also see heretics, those who stray from the faith, as people who should be killed. Now, these are not new ideas. I mean, obviously, these ideas have been around for a long time. So maybe you could say Ferdinand II is not really a modern creature. He's not kind of a creature of modern times. You could also go further and say maybe he's not a typical European. I mean, maybe he is, maybe he isn't. You remember I talked about the other day some of the legacies in Christianity, the famous Canossa incident. There's a popular book out right now called Millennium. It's by an author called Tom Holland. Actually, this is the English edition. I think the American edition is called something very different, but actually the UK edition would probably be better for you. It's sort of a popular history about the 11th century. So it talks about the Crusades along with a lot of other things. And his central kind of theme or dramatic he sets up in the prologue is this Canossa incident, this whole question of how did the Western world come to be unique? It's kind of a counterintuitive argument that he makes because, he's saying that, everyone says, oh, well, the West came of age, became modern because of the Renaissance, the kind of rediscovery of ancient texts, the revivification. Renaissance literally means rebirth of ancient learning and wisdom in politics, literature, sciences, and so on. And he's saying, no, it wasn't that at all. It was actually just this relationship between king and pope. It was the fact that the pope declared this kind of spiritual realm to be off limits. The division, remember, between church and state. That they were separate. A lot of Christians today like to say it's always been that way, right? That is what distinguishes Christianity. Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar. This is the idea that Christians have that not all cultures have had. Well, maybe. But I mean, no idea is ever forever. Ideas depend on circumstance. And oftentimes, circumstance can change. So that had things gone the other way, and had in this 11th century that the popular history writes about, had the Saxon kings who were striving to be, again, Holy Roman emperors, had they in fact put the Pope in his place, so to speak, by surrounding the Pope, as some of them actually did from time to time. They would have their own man appointed Pope, basically, to try to control the papacy. Had they succeeded, then maybe the Western world wouldn't have become that different. Now, as to whether or not it matters, I don't know. I mean, again, your more material economic or military historians will say none of that really matters that much. What really matters is the lessons of the battlefield, military technology, order and drill, and all the rest of it. But I think you can't completely discount the importance of this stuff. So Ferdinand II represents, again, a little bit more like a path not taken in European history. The Europeans, had someone like Ferdinand II triumphed, might very well have ended up looking a lot more like, let's say, the Ottoman Sultan caliphs. You know, a single emperor controlling a religious establishment, seeing himself as God's regent on earth, doing battle with infidels. Now, among which, of course, probably would have been found Ottoman Muslims. If Europe had been unified under a great Christian emperor, then probably its very first goal would have been going to war with the Ottoman Emperor. Instead, you actually got something very different, in fact, very strange. The most powerful state in Europe after 1648, after the Peace of Westphalia. Well, which was the most powerful state? I mean, we talked about this the other day. France, right. Okay, so you have France, again, not a hegemon. It doesn't control Europe, but in a way it's kind of running things behind the scenes. I mean, this is true. Let's say if you look at the 19th century, it's often called the Pax Britannica. It's not that the British actually ruled the world. It's that they were the most important power in the world, so that their way of doing things held sway. A little bit like since 1945, the United States has been the leading power. Such that, I mean, if you ever really think about this, it's kind of strange that suddenly democracy is all the rage, isn't it? Like if you look at human history in its entirety, democracy kind of doesn't really appear all that often. And in fact, it wasn't always seen to be such a great thing. I mean, in ancient Greece, it was considered one among many forms of government. Did you all read Aristotle in Hegev? Yeah, Politics. Did you read the Politics? No, you read, which did you read? What is it? Oh, okay. Well, anyway, the idea, again, of the systems of government, some of this goes back to Aristotle, is they all have vices and virtues, right? You have oligarchy, monarchy. Oligarchy or kind of aristocracy, you know, with a number of elites. And then you have democracy. And there are advantages and disadvantages to all of them. Democracy, well, you don't get oppressed, maybe. But on the other hand, as we're seeing in the modern West, democracy has other dangers. The masses will only elect politicians who do things that are popular. So politicians will promise them things, you know, like pensions. You can retire when you're 45. I guess in Turkey, actually, it's funny because here the pensions start even earlier, but then you don't make very much. Whereas in Europe and America, everyone's going bankrupt because of these pensions. And why do we have the pensions? Well, it's because politicians promise people what they want. Because they want to be popular, because that's what a democracy is. You grub for votes. Demos. I mean, demos basically comes from the same root as mob. So anyway, so democracy, at least in the last 50 years, is all the rage. Everyone's a Democrat, right? I mean, even like your kind of crackpot dictator who stages these elections where he gets 99% of the vote, you know, and is not a real Democrat, he still claims to be a Democrat. Everybody holds elections. Why? Well, it's the fashion. Why is it the fashion? Well, because America has been kind of the most powerful country in the world for about 50 years. You know, this might change. If China emerges as the great power, I don't know if everyone's going to go communist again, but probably you're going to have a more Chinese way of doing things. I mean, some people might say that China's way of operating in the world is actually fairly close to raison d'etat today. You know, with certain alterations because the Communist Party still has some pretenses of ideology, but basically they've scrapped it mostly. You know, they're pragmatists, they're practical. And a world in which China is the leading power will probably look very different from a world in which America is the leading power. So anyway, the Europe that emerges after 1648, you know, is very much not Ferdinand II's world. It's the world of Richelieu. I mean, even if Richelieu is no longer in power, which he isn't, he's really only in office from, what, 1624 to 1642. Europe was living in Richelieu's world afterwards. Living in a world where suddenly everyone kind of took this to heart. The idea that the state has no immortality, its salvation is now or never. It doesn't sound like much, but what it really means is states can do pretty much what they want. That is, so long as they don't run up against the interests of other states. And if they do, they might go to war. And if they go to war, then the war will last a certain amount of time, and then it will be over. And one state will gain something, and the other state will lose something. Now, again, it doesn't sound all that exciting. And in fact, in some ways, it's not. It's not a terribly romantic way of kind of running the world. But on the other hand, there is something to be said for it, because it does limit conflict, at least to some extent. You're no longer fighting to exterminate the enemy, or exterminate heresy, or spread the faith far into the lands of the infidel, or even conquer Islam. Yeah, I talked about Islam, and this is interesting. France was actually the power among everyone in Europe that was actually the most friendly towards the Ottoman Empire. Not because Frenchmen had any particular love for Muslims, but because they shared a common enemy, essentially, in the Hapsburgs, the Austrian branch of the Hapsburgs, which was, of course, the primary land war opponent of the Ottoman Empire. Well, really, at least until the Russians emerged in the 18th century as a greater threat to the Ottoman Empire. So because of its enmity with the Habsburgs, which, remember, dominates this whole period. We have like the Habsburg-Valois wars around 1500. A lot of that's fought over who gets to control Italy. A little bit later, you have wars involving places like Spain, which is also against the Habsburg. But basically, the key dynamic is France is fighting against the Habsburgs. And because the Habsburgs, with their primary power base in Vienna, which becomes kind of the unofficial seat of the Holy Roman Empire, their main enemy is the Ottoman Empire. So now you have a world system where Europe, in some ways, is not necessarily that antipathetic to the Ottoman Empire. The Austrians continue to fight. The Russians continue to fight. But no one else in Europe has any interest in fighting against the Ottoman Empire. The French certainly don't. In fact, to some extent, the new dynamic becomes France is the new bully, and then everyone tries to keep the French from dominating. I mean, we'll look at that next week when we look at the Sun King. Oops. Louis XIV, Louis XIV. We remember him at all from Hegev? Yeah, what was, do you remember his phrase? The most famous phrase, he said. Something like, "L'État, c'est moi." The state, it is me. I am the state, basically. L'État, c'est moi. So you have a couple of things. You have like a ruthless, cynical way of operating in the world. Everyone wants to be like the French in a way. But you also have a political system which becomes dominant. We usually call it absolutism. Now, again, not everyone copies the French. In fact, once people team up against the French, particularly the Dutch and the English, then they will eventually defeat the French. And once they're running the world, then a new kind of a system emerges. But that's what happens with these wars. I mean, the thing is, wars, they tend to live on even after they're over. The 30 Years' War was endlessly destructive, particularly of life and limb and property and land in a place like Germany. But in terms of its impact on Europe, the real result of it was to kill off any kind of possibility of a unified empire in Europe, and to lead to a somewhat more cynical, again, raison d'etat world of nation-states pursuing their own interests. Fighting lots of wars, frankly. I mean, that's the interesting thing, is like you might think that Europe would be so exhausted from this war, the endless wars in 1648. I mean, almost 150 years of near constant civil war and warfare over religion and this and that. Well, there was a kind of pause as everyone, caught their breath. England, meanwhile, we haven't even talked about them very much, but they didn't really fight in the 30 Years' War, mostly because they were wrapped up in their own civil war at the time, which importantly had to do with public finance. We'll talk about that next week. It's not that they stopped fighting wars. It's just the wars, as I've said, they take on these, frankly, kind of strange tones. They're all called the War of the something succession, right? The War of the English succession or the Austrian succession. So this isn't necessarily new either, but the idea that a war is fought simply over the question of which family inherits which line. You eventually get this concept of rule by legitimate descent. Again, which has nothing to do with the sentiment of the governed, and has nothing to do with popular sovereignty. It's all about kind of this cynical horse trading between great aristocratic and royal families, who are all talking about which family inherits, which throne or which duchy or which bishopric or which area or which territory, which system of revenue. Is it worth? Some of them are even like worthless, like Corsica famously, where Napoleon is from. At times they would fight wars and Corsica would be a prize they would talk about. And then once they actually started ruling the place, they said, oh, let's not bother. There's no real income there. There's no reason to even try to own Corsica. So you get these wars that are, frankly, not really that inspiring. On the other hand, the soldiers who are fighting the wars, this is the part that is really the most mysterious. Because in some ways you can understand why the warriors in the kind of early glory days of Islam would fight. At least why we're told they fought. They fought out of belief, out of conviction, fighting for God. Not unlike the way some people fought in the religious wars. The most mysterious thing about the wars of 18th century Europe, which we'll start to look at next week, is really that the men fought at all. Because most of them were enlisted men, were essentially kind of prisoners of their army with no rights. Like most soldiers, they can't desert, obviously. They have to follow orders. And meanwhile, the way they would fight, the European style of warfare which is emerging, which is both expensive and also colossally brutal. They all just line up in rows. They fire at each other at close range. And then some of them die, some of them live, and then they fire again until one force succeeds the other in the battlefield. These battles wouldn't last terribly long. They would be in like a very small place, an enclosed area, almost like by tacit agreement, this is where the battle would take place. And what would be determined would be, again, horse trading of borders, possibly hundreds of miles away. The closer you look at modern European history, really, the more remarkable it seems. Remarkable that men would actually fight and die for those reasons, or you might say for those lack of reasons. But that said, they're getting really good at it. That's the other thing about this era. They're getting a lot of practice. They're getting a lot of practice in close order drill. They're getting a lot of practice in marksmanship, that is, in shooting accuracy, in tactics, in basically closing ranks and keeping order on the battlefield, in not running. The discipline is really, that's the thing that's the most shocking and stunning about European armies. The fact that the men will stay in these rows and not fire. Why are they doing this? Well, again, this is one of the great questions. The usual explanation is you go from religion to nationalism, right? You get kind of, suddenly these men are fighting for France, or for, maybe not Germany yet, but they might be fighting for England, or they're fighting for Holland. You could understand why the Dutch fought against the Spanish for 80 years. They're fighting, as they see, for their homeland. They're fighting to rule themselves. Sometimes the men fight for gain, right? They think that they're going to get some loot or some booty on the field. But the really curious thing about modern Europe, particularly after these religious wars, is again that men often seem to be fighting for no reason at all. At least if you look at their own interests, their own beliefs. But still they fight. And the question as to why they fight, and why they fight as they do, that to me is one of the most interesting questions of particularly military history, and even to some extent political history. Why Europeans are able to fight in this particular way. There's no glory in being just a cog in a kind of battle machine. You're not like a Spahi cavalryman of the Ottoman Empire. You're not like one of those crusading knights, with his chain mail, on horseback. These are infantry. That's the new warfare that everyone talks about in military revolution. Infantry are now so disciplined and so lethal. Even if their guns aren't as accurate as they would be later, yes, their range is not, more than at most 100 or 200 meters. Even at 200 meters, they're not very accurate. But that said, if the men will stay in ranks, and you also have the bayonet, of course. You've got the sword point at the end of the guns, for what happens when you get into the melee at the end of the battle. But what's amazing about this, again, is the discipline that the men will do this and they will close ranks. Going back to the first week, you remember we talked about some of these general reasons for the rise of the West, and this is clearly one of them, that idea of a Western way of warfare. Going back to the ancient phalanx of the Greeks, or possibly the legions of the Romans. I don't know how I ended up talking about military history. I think we were supposed to be talking about ideas here, read Richelieu. Well, okay, so what do we make of Richelieu? We've been introduced to him. At least some of us read Kissinger a little bit. enough to get an idea of the man? You raised your hand in the back. Did you read a little? Yeah. So, I mean, what do you think of him like as a person? You think he would have been? No, Richelieu. Yeah. Richelieu. I mean. Oh, well, okay. Just your general about Kissinger, right? Well, what is Kissinger trying to say then? Yeah. That's Kennedy more than Kissinger. Yeah, that was Kennedy, right. That's okay. Tell him. Well, Richelieu, the little I've talked about him then, if you haven't read much about him. I mean, what does he seem like? Does he seem like someone you'd want to know? You'd want to be friends with? Like, if you were, a better way of looking at it, if you were a king, would you want to have him as an advisor? Yes? He's effective, right? Why? Mm-hmm.
So he has to
yeah.
A lot of arms on the country, like everyone.
So Ferdinand II, he's got advisors too, right? But, I mean, maybe he's not really listening to them? I mean, he's listening to God, right? He thinks God is telling him what to do. Right? So anyway, so his advisor is God in a way. Which I suppose in a way just means he's advising himself, right? He thinks God is kind of telling him what to do. Whereas, we haven't even talked about Richelieu. The king, in a way, is kind of irrelevant. I mean, Louis XIII, remember how young he was when Richelieu first started. He was like 12, 13 years old. The Queen Mother was the important one. And anyway, Richelieu manipulates him. If you haven't read the Kissinger book, I'll just share you a small passage, because I think this is very interesting. You remember that for the first couple years of the 30 Years' War, Richelieu and France, they were not directly involved. They're just subsidizing all the Protestants again. Very cynically, kind of like, let them all kill each other. This is great. Everyone will weaken, each other, and France will benefit because we won't have to fight. But then he decides, after a certain point, partly because the Spanish get really directly involved, France's borders may be under. Anyway, France needs to fight. So he tries to explain to the king why it is that for 12 years he's been saying, don't fight, just pay everyone else to fight. And now he's saying, okay, we need to fight too. Because you might think at first glance that's a contradiction, right? I mean, if, let's say, you're a simple-minded man, like the king wasn't really all that intelligent. I mean, he wasn't dumb, but he wasn't like super bright. And your key advisor has been telling you, don't fight, don't fight, don't fight, for like 12 years. Now suddenly he says, now's the time to fight. Well, you might be a little skeptical. So this is the argument that Richelieu comes up with. He says, and this is all done in the form of flattery, of course, telling the king how clever he is. He says, it's a sign of your singular prudence to have held down the forces opposed to your state, that is to France, for a period of 10 years with the forces of your allies, by putting your hand in your pocket. Now that is basically by using your wallet, and not on your sword. Then now to engage in warfare when your allies can no longer exist without you, that is, to go to war now, is a sign of courage and great wisdom, which shows that in husbanding the peace of your kingdom, you have behaved like those economists who, having taken care to save money, also know how to spend money. Does that make any sense at all? If you understood it? First you save your money, and then you spend your money. I guess it kind of makes sense, right? I mean, if you save money, you get to spend it, but what does that have to do with war, right? I mean, before he was paying money to have other people fight, and now he's going to pay money to have Frenchmen fight. It's all a bunch of nonsense, isn't it? I mean, it's very clever, I guess. I mean, basically all he's saying is, before there was an argument for not fighting, and now there's an argument for fighting. And you're brilliant, and so whatever you do is right because I tell you. I guess. I think that's what he's saying. I mean, that's the trouble with these kind of advisors like Richelieu and Bismarck. They're really brilliant, particularly in the way they can manipulate. I mean, it's almost never a king himself, who is behind a doctrine like this. It's usually the power behind the throne. all he has to do is kind of flatter the king. The same way he flattered Marie de Medici by talking about her great beauty and wisdom and so on. Now he's just basically telling the king, you're brilliant, and so whatever you do is brilliant. It's like a tautology. Just so long as he twists it around, he can get the king to do anything. And he doesn't have to explain to the king why it is that suddenly it makes sense to join the war, whereas before it didn't. I mean, maybe this only works with, gullible and weak kings. But on the other hand, it does show the power of, shall we say, for lack of a better word, flexibility. A moral flexibility. He's not making a moral argument at all. It's all based on whether it's effective or not. There's no appeal to religion. There's no appeal really even to philosophy. There's no ideology. There's no there. It's just statesmanship. There's a famous essay actually by Isaiah Berlin, who I doubt you've heard of, but the reason I like this, it was an essay on statesmanship. And what's great about Berlin is that he's a really intelligent man he was actually originally Russian. He was born in Russia and then escaped when he was about, I think, 6 or 7 years old in 1917 at the time of the Russian Revolution. So he saw what ideology could do, that it could make men kill, like it did in Russia. This terrible civil war. Now, some of it came from the First World War, some from the ideology of the communists, some from their opponents. But anyway, ideas, ideology could make men kill for no reason. So he recoiled from that, and the rest of his life he was a great critic of ideology. He was good at understanding ideologies and at kind of explaining why they were wrong or why you shouldn't think in that way. The interesting thing about this, though, is that when he tried to put his own ideas into a system, into what he said basically he had learned from a life of studying history, politics, international relations, and all of this, he's saying, trying to explain why some statesmen are just better than others, right? Why a Richelieu is effective. Why a Bismarck was maybe the greatest, as he called it, statesman of the modern era. Just in terms of, again, getting results, right? You talk about like you're running a company, you want to get results. You want to have a good quarter. You want to have a good year. You want to have a good 10 years. A ruler who does well for his sovereign, for his state. And he thought about it, and he tried out about like 10 or 20 different metaphors and ideas, and he's trying to think like, just how do you describe it? Like, how can you explain a Richelieu or a Bismarck? In other words, like, how do you tell someone else how to be like that? And he finally said, look, you can't. Some people are just good at it. and what he said it was really closest to, that is statesmanship. Don't tell the people in the IR theory courses I told you this, because I think they put a lot of stock in the various theories. But what he finally said is that the real essence of statesmanship is a little bit like driving a car. You can't really explain what makes someone a good driver. But like a good driver, when you see one. I mean, particularly in this country, it's important to be a good driver because otherwise you'll be dead, frankly. I mean, the way people drive here, it's like nobody follows the rules. You have to go by instinct, right? I mean, some people run red lights, other people don't run red lights. I'm sorry, but this is true. Okay, so anyway, right, some people run the red light, sometimes they don't. Like right in front of Real, right? Sometimes like 5 people go in front of the red light, sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 0. People, frankly, they don't follow the rules. And so you have to trust your instincts in a way. You have to be alert. You have to look around you. You have to notice the changing correlation of circumstance. How many cars are on the road? The lights, whether they're working, what the terrain is like, whether the road is smooth. It's a little bit like statesmanship. Richelieu didn't have some system like Ferdinand II did, where he just said, this is what I do. He just responded to circumstance. And he did so well. Again, why? Well, just because he was good at it. I don't know if there's really any more kind of sophisticated way of describing it than that. I mean, that's what I like about Berlin's essay. Is like he finally admitted that he couldn't really figure it out. And the best way he could describe it is it's a little bit like driving a car, and that you're kind of either good at it or you aren't. Or you can be better at it. But that essentially it's a skill. It's a skill not everyone has. But it's a skill you recognize when you see it. There's a reason that we're still studying Richelieu today, just like we study Bismarck. In a way that we don't study somebody like Napoleon III, that is the nephew of the first Napoleon, who kind of ran France into the ground and was an utter disaster and everything. Okay, yeah, you study people like that, but for different reasons, like to kind of see what not to do. But anyway, that's what interests me about international affairs, particularly in modern history. I'm fascinated by people like Richelieu and Bismarck, and I hope some of you will be fascinated too, because I think they're interesting. Realpolitik, I guess, happens much later in the term when we get to Bismarck. For next week, just to give you a little bit of an idea of what to look for, we're going to be looking at the essence of public finance, particularly as it pertains to warfare, the sinews of war, as a recent historian called it. That is, the ability of states not just to raise money, not just to produce wealth, but to channel that wealth into the direction of financing armies and navies. That being really the real essence of modern power. It's not necessarily how wealthy you are, it's how you can translate that wealth into power. And that's the lesson that I think the British probably learned better than anyone else, and they learned it from the Dutch. The French turned out to be not quite as good at that as they were at cynical horse trading raison d'etat in this era.